The crying started exactly 37 minutes after takeoff. Captain James Harlow was alone in the cockpit of Flight 2187, cruising at 33,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, when he first heard it. The unmistakable wail of an infant, so close it seemed to be coming from right beside him. But that was impossible. No babies were allowed in the cockpit, no passengers at all, and he was completely alone. My name is Dr. Eleanor Reeves, aviation psychologist and incident investigator with the Air Safety Board for 17 years. What I'm about to share with you has been deliberately kept from official records and public knowledge. The audio recordings, flight logs, and witness testimonies were meant to be buried forever. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe now. This channel exposes aviation mysteries and forbidden reports the industry tries to hide. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation that powerful interests don't want revealed. Captain Harlow was a veteran pilot with over 24,000 flight hours spanning 22 years. His psychological evaluations had always shown exceptional stability, even in crisis situations. He had no history of auditory hallucinations, mental illness, or substance abuse. His colleagues described him as methodical, by the book, and the last person who would imagine things. Until that night in November of 2019, when everything changed. Flight 2187 was a routine cargo transport from London to New York. The weather was clear, with minimal turbulence expected. The aircraft, a Boeing 777, had passed all safety inspections the previous week. There were no mechanical concerns. Harlow's co-pilot, First Officer Marissa Chen, had stepped out of the cockpit to use the lavatory, leaving Harlow alone for what should have been just a few minutes. That's when he heard it. The crying. At first, I thought I was hearing something from the cargo hold, Harlow later stated in his confidential report. But it was too clear, too close. It sounded like it was coming from the empty seat beside me. The crying continued, growing louder and more distressed. Harlow checked the intercom system, thinking perhaps it was picking up sounds from the cabin. It wasn't. He checked radio frequencies, emergency channels, even removed his headset entirely. The crying continued. When First Officer Chen returned to the cockpit 2 minutes later, Harlow immediately asked if she could hear it too. She couldn't. The cockpit voice recorder captured their exchange. Harlow: "You don't hear that? The baby crying?" Chen: "What baby? I don't hear anything, Captain." Harlow: It's right here, right between us. James, there's no baby on this plane. We're carrying electronics and mail." But Harlow insisted he could hear it, describing the cries as desperate and frightened. Chen, concerned about her captain's state of mind, suggested he take a break, get some water, maybe rest for a moment. Harlow refused. The plane needed to be flown, and he wasn't going to abandon his post over what he convinced himself must be a trick of the mind. Perhaps stress-induced, perhaps the result of the new blood pressure medication he'd started the previous week. But the crying didn't stop. For the next 43 minutes, Harlow endured it, trying to focus on flying, while the sound of an invisible infant wailed beside him. Chen reported that she observed him constantly glancing to his right, toward the empty first officer's seat when she briefly stepped out again, his face contorted in what appeared to be a mixture of confusion and distress. Then, suddenly, the crying stopped. Just like that. Mid-wail, it cut off completely. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the crying itself. Harlow felt a chill run down his spine, the kind of primal fear response humans evolved to warn them of predators. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. 3 minutes later, the cockpit master caution light illuminated. A pressure valve in the cargo hold was malfunctioning. Nothing catastrophic, easily handled with standard procedures. But the timing sent a shiver through the experienced captain. It was as if someone was trying to alert me, he would later tell me during our confidential sessions. As if the crying was a warning. The flight continued without further incident. landing safely at JFK International Airport 17 minutes ahead of schedule. Harlow filed a standard report about the pressure valve, but made no mention of what he'd heard. He told himself it was a one-time event, a strange anomaly that wouldn't repeat itself. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, Harlow was piloting Flight 4423, another cargo route, this time from Frankfurt to Chicago. Different plane, different crew, same phenomenon. Only this time, the crying started during pre-flight checks, while the plane was still at the gate. It was louder this time, Harlow reported, more desperate, and it seemed to be coming from the avionics bay beneath the cockpit floor. His co-pilot that day, Jeffrey Morgan, also heard nothing. Once again, the crying stopped abruptly, this time just moments before a ground crew member rushed to inform them that a fuel line had been incorrectly connected during servicing. Had they taken off without discovering this error, the consequences could have been catastrophic. After this second incident, Harlow confidentially reached out to the airline's medical officer, Dr. Sarah Williams. He was concerned about his mental health, wondering if he might be experiencing the early signs of a neurological condition. Comprehensive tests, brain scans, hearing evaluations, psychological assessments revealed nothing abnormal. Physically and mentally, James Harlow was perfectly sound. And yet, the crying continued. Flight after flight, always when something was about to go wrong with the aircraft. Always just before a mechanical issue manifested. Always heard only by him. By February of 2020, after 6 separate incidents, the pattern was undeniable. Each time Harlow heard the phantom infant, a mechanical problem would emerge within minutes. Each time, despite the absence of any visible or audible warning signs available to the crew, Harlow was somehow being alerted to these issues before they registered on the aircraft's sophisticated monitoring systems. The airline quietly began an internal investigation, careful to keep the details out of official FAA reports. They feared the implications of a pilot claiming to hear supernatural warnings. The aviation industry, for all its embrace of cutting-edge technology, remains deeply superstitious at its core. Pilots who report unexplainable phenomena often find themselves grounded, their careers effectively ended. But Harlow was too valuable, his record too impeccable, to dismiss outright. And the timing of these episodes, with actual mechanical issues, was becoming harder and harder to dismiss as coincidence. In March, the airline assigned me to the case. My initial hypothesis was that Harlow was subconsciously picking up on subtle vibrations or sounds, perhaps even small changes in air pressure or the pitch of the engines, that his conscious mind was then interpreting as a baby's cry. The human brain is remarkably adept at pattern recognition, and experienced pilots often develop a sixth sense about their aircraft, noticing problems before instruments can detect them. But this theory failed to explain the specificity of what Harlow was experiencing. Why a baby? Why crying? And why did the sound seem to come from different locations in the cockpit each time? Then came Flight 59-1, and everything changed. On April 12, 2020, Harlow was commanding a passenger flight from Boston to San Francisco. 3 hours into the journey, at 37,000 feet over the Midwest, he heard it again, the crying. Only this time, it was different. It was softer, he told me later, almost like whimpering, and it seemed to be coming from the overhead panel near the circuit breakers. Following what had now become his standard protocol, Harlow alerted his first officer, Victoria Santos, that he was hearing the sound again. She acknowledged with a nod. By this point, a small circle of crew members knew about Harlow's experiences, even if they didn't fully understand them, and began running additional system checks. 5 minutes passed. The crying continued. No mechanical issues presented themselves. 10 minutes. Still nothing. After 15 minutes of continuous crying, the longest any episode had lasted, Harlow began to wonder if, perhaps, finally, he was actually experiencing hallucinations. Perhaps the previous correlations with mechanical problems had been mere coincidences. and his mind was now creating a false pattern. And then flight attendant Michaela Desai knocked on the cockpit door. There was a situation in the cabin. A young mother in first class was having difficulty calming her 3-month-old son. The baby had been crying inconsolably for the past 15 minutes. Normally, this wouldn't warrant alerting the cockpit, but there was something unusual about the situation. The infant seemed to be staring fixedly at the ceiling, pointing toward the cockpit, even as he wailed. Santos left her seat to investigate, leaving Harlow alone with the phantom crying still echoing in his ears. When she returned 7 minutes later, her face was pale. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The baby down there, it stopped crying the moment I approached. And then it looked right at me and said something, clear as day." The cockpit voice recorder captured what followed. Harlow: "Santos, babies that age don't talk." Santos: "I know that. I have 3 kids. But I swear to you, this child looked me in the eye and said, 'Check overhead panel C, circuit 47B. Those exact words. Then it started crying again. That's where the sound is coming from." What happened next defies conventional explanation. Following the bizarre instruction, Harlow and Santos examined the indicated circuit, a backup system for the aircraft's pressurization controls. The circuit itself showed no signs of malfunction. All indicators were normal. But when Santos pressed lightly on the surrounding panel, a small access cover came loose, revealing something that should never have been there. A small incendiary device, roughly the size of a cigarette pack, wired to what appeared to be a timer. The device was hidden in a way that would have bypassed standard security and maintenance checks. It had been professionally installed, designed to destroy critical avionics systems while creating a cascade of electrical failures that would have been nearly impossible to recover from at cruising altitude. The flight was immediately diverted to the nearest suitable airport, Denver International, where it landed without incident. The passengers were told there was a minor mechanical issue requiring inspection. The FBI was waiting when they landed. The subsequent investigation revealed that the device had been planted by a maintenance worker who had been secretly radicalized by an extremist organization. He had successfully placed similar devices on 2 other aircraft in the fleet, both of which had experienced catastrophic failures over the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, with all lives lost. Those crashes had been attributed to a design flaw in a specific avionics component. No one had suspected sabotage. But how could an infant, a 3-month-old child incapable of speech, have known about the device? How could Captain Harlow have heard crying coming from the exact location where it was hidden? These questions have no rational answers. The baby's mother, when interviewed separately by federal agents, confirmed that her child had been staring at the ceiling and crying for approximately 15 minutes before flight attendant Desai approached. She denied that her baby had spoken any words, indeed insisted that he had not yet begun to babble, let alone form complex sentences about aircraft circuitry. Medical records confirmed the child was developing normally for his age, with no speech capabilities. First Officer Santos, however, remained adamant about what she'd heard. 4 separate polygraph tests indicated she was telling the truth, or at least believed she was telling the truth, about the baby speaking to her. The FBI investigation into the sabotage plot continued for months, eventually uncovering a complex network of operatives with access to multiple airlines' maintenance facilities. 11 individuals were ultimately arrested. None of them had any connection to the infant on Flight 5951 or its mother. The child's father, initially a suspect, was confirmed to have been 3,000 miles away when the device was planted. As for Captain Harlow, he continued to hear the crying on occasional flights for the next year. Each time, it preceded the discovery of a mechanical issue, though none as potentially catastrophic as the incendiary device. The phenomenon eventually faded, with his last reported incident occurring in May of 2021. He remains an active pilot for the airline, though he now exclusively flies cargo routes at his own request. The case of Flight 5091 remains classified as unexplained aerial phenomenon human interaction in the Air Safety Board's restricted files. It is one of 17 such cases documented in North American airspace since 1977. But this is where the official record ends, and where the truth begins to emerge. 6 months after the Flight 5091 incident, while reviewing maintenance records for an unrelated investigation, I discovered something that sent a chill down my spine. The maintenance worker who had planted the incendiary devices had previously worked for another airline, one that had experienced a catastrophic crash 12 years earlier. Flight 2290, en route from Chicago to London, had disappeared over the North Atlantic with all 178 souls on board. Among the passengers was a young couple, the Krauses, traveling with their 3-month-old son, Jacob. The timing of the disappearance, the location of the presumed crash, the suspected cause, catastrophic electrical failure, all aligned with the methodology of the saboteur. Though the wreckage was never recovered from the deep ocean, the similarities were striking enough to warrant reopening the investigation. DNA samples from items belonging to Jacob Krause's parents, preserved in the evidence archives, were compared to those of the infant on Flight 5091. The results were conclusive. No relation. The babies were not the same child, not genetically at least. But then we found the flight manifest for the doomed Flight 2290. Seat 4C, where the Krause family had been seated, had originally been assigned to none other than James Harlow, who at the time was a young first officer for the airline. He had been bumped from the flight at the last minute to cover for a colleague on another route. The seat where he should have died had been given to a family with a 3-month-old baby boy. When I presented this information to Captain Harlow in a confidential interview, his reaction was recorded as follows. "I remember that flight. I was supposed to be on it, deadheading back to London. I was angry about being reassigned. I had plans in London that weekend. I recall seeing the family that took my seat. The mother was struggling with the baby's car seat. I helped her install it. The baby was crying. I remember thinking how glad I was not to be seated next to an infant for 7 hours. His voice broke then, and the recording captures 17 seconds of silence before he continued. Are you telling me that same baby has been warning me for 2 years? Warning me about things that would have killed people? I had no answer for him. Science provides none. But the pattern continued to reveal itself in ways that defy rational explanation. Further research uncovered 6 other incidents across 4 airlines, where pilots reported hearing phantom sounds, not always crying babies, but often children's voices, laughter, or singing, prior to discovering serious mechanical issues. In each case, the specific sound correlated to a child who had previously died in an aviation disaster. The aviation industry has long acknowledged the existence of so-called ghost flights, aircraft that briefly appear on radar where they shouldn't be, often corresponding to the exact flight paths of planes that crashed years or decades earlier. These are typically dismissed as equipment malfunctions or atmospheric anomalies. But what if they are something more? What if, somehow, those lost in the violence of aviation disasters leave behind more than wreckage and grief? What if some essential part of them remains, attached to the skies where they perished, or to the people who, by chance or fate, escaped their destiny? The case took an even stranger turn 3 months ago, when Captain Harlow was deadheading on a flight from New York to London, this time as a passenger. Seated next to him was a young mother with, yes, a 3-month-old baby boy. According to Harlow, the infant, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly awoke during turbulence, looked directly at him, and reached out a tiny hand toward his face. The baby didn't cry. Instead, Harlow described hearing, not with his ears, but inside his mind, a child's voice saying simply, "It wasn't your time then, it's not their time now." Moments later, the captain announced they would be diverting to Shannon, Ireland, due to a minor indicator light requiring inspection. The nature of the mechanical issue was never disclosed to passengers, but internal records show it involved a hairline crack in a hydraulic line that had begun to leak fluid, a condition that would have become critical approximately 40 minutes later over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where rescue would have been extremely difficult. The infant on that flight was Jacob Matheson, born to parents with no connection to aviation, no history of air disasters in their family. A perfectly ordinary child, except for one detail discovered during the subsequent confidential investigation. He had been born at exactly 4:17 a.m. on December 3rd. The precise moment Flight 2290 is believed to have impacted the North Atlantic 12 years earlier. Is this coincidence? Perhaps. The human mind is adept at finding patterns where none exist, at creating connections to make sense of a random universe. Yet the statistical probability of these overlapping details occurring by chance has been calculated by our analysts at less than 1 in 12 million. Captain Harlow continues to fly regularly. He has not reported hearing the phantom crying in 8 months. When asked if he believes the phenomenon has ended, he responded with a strange half-smile. "I don't think it ever ends. I think maybe I just don't need the warnings anymore. Maybe I've learned to listen in other ways." The airline industry has quietly implemented a new section in their confidential reporting system, officially labeled Anomalous Sensory Phenomena, where crew members can document experiences that fall outside conventional explanation. In the first 6 months since its implementation, 73 reports have been filed from pilots and crew members across 6 continents. 42 of those reports involved the sounds of children, crying, laughing, singing, or speaking, heard in empty cockpits or cabin areas. 39 of those incidents preceded the discovery of potential mechanical issues that, if left unaddressed, could have resulted in serious incidents. As for the infant on Flight 5091 who allegedly spoke to First Officer Santos, he is now 3 years old, developing normally with no memory of the incident. His mother reports only one unusual behavior. Whenever an aircraft passes overhead, no matter how high, he stops whatever he's doing, looks up, and waves. Perhaps some doors, once opened between worlds, never fully close. The aviation industry has always existed at the boundary between science and the unknown. Aircraft operate in an environment humans were never meant to survive, the thin, cold upper atmosphere, where the margin for error is measured in seconds and small mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. Perhaps it's not surprising that in this liminal space, where life and death hang in precarious balance, the conventional boundaries between past and present, between the living and those who have passed, might sometimes blur. For those of us who investigate these cases, who document the unexplainable while searching for rational answers, one thing has become increasingly clear. The skies hold more mysteries than our instruments can measure or our minds can comprehend. In the years since Flight 5091, 5 other aircraft have been found to contain hidden sabotage devices during unscheduled inspections triggered by pilots reporting unusual sounds or sensations in the cockpit. In all 5 cases, the discoveries prevented potential disasters. In all 5 cases, the pilots described hearing sounds that shouldn't have been there. Children's voices, crying, laughter. The airline industry continues to officially attribute these discoveries to enhanced security protocols and routine inspections. Those of us who have access to the complete files know differently. Captain Harlow retired last month after 30 years of service. At his retirement ceremony, he was approached by a young man in his early 20s who introduced himself as the brother of Jacob Krause, the infant who had perished on Flight 2290. The young man had been sick with flu on the day of the flight and had stayed behind with grandparents while his parents and baby brother traveled ahead. What he told Harlow was recorded by a nearby security camera, though without audio. Lip-reading experts later determined he said, "My brother wanted me to thank you for listening when no one else would." Harlow, visibly shaken, asked how he could possibly know about the crying, about any of it. According to witnesses, the young man replied, "Because sometimes, when planes fly overhead, I hear him too. He's still up there. They all are." The Krause family had no other children after the loss of their son and parents. The young man who approached Harlow has never been identified, despite extensive efforts. The security footage shows him walking away from the reception, down a long terminal corridor, and simply disappearing from frame. No exit is visible in that section of the terminal. No doors or turns. The figure simply vanishes between one camera frame and the next. When asked about this final encounter, Harlow would say only, "Some debts can never be repaid." Some warnings come too late for some, but just in time for others. I don't question it anymore. I just listen. As for myself, I've spent 22 years investigating aviation incidents, searching for logical explanations for the mechanical failures and human errors that lead to disasters. I've always prided myself on rationality, on finding the tangible causes behind seemingly mysterious events. Until last month, when I boarded Flight 1127 from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, a routine trip, a half-empty aircraft on a clear autumn day. I had been assigned a window seat. As we reached cruising altitude, I noticed a young woman with an infant in the row ahead of me. The baby was sleeping peacefully. Halfway through the flight, as I was reviewing documents for this very report, I heard it. Soft at first, then increasingly insistent. A baby's cry, coming not from the infant ahead of me, who was still sleeping, but from somewhere else. Somewhere impossible. It seemed to be coming from inside the aircraft wall beside my seat. I pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, I asked if she heard the crying. She didn't. No one did. Just me. I reported the sensation to the captain, breaking my own protocols about confidentiality. To his credit, he took it seriously. The aircraft diverted to Minneapolis, where a maintenance team discovered a critical fault in the bleed air system running through the wall beside my seat. A fault that would have resulted in gradual depressurization over the Rocky Mountains, potentially incapacitating everyone on board before they were aware of the danger. The infant who had been sleeping ahead of me? I checked the manifest later. There was no baby recorded on that flight. When I requested the security camera footage from boarding, it showed me walking down the aisle, taking my seat, settling in with my documents. The row ahead of me was empty. What do you think happens to those who die in the space between earth and sky? Where do their souls go when there is no ground to return to? No final resting place but the endless air. Perhaps they stay where they are, trapped in the thin boundary between worlds. Perhaps they watch over those still traveling through their domain. Perhaps they try to warn us, in the only ways they can, when history threatens to repeat itself. The next time you're on an aircraft and hear an unexpected sound, a child's laugh when there are no children nearby, a cry from an empty overhead bin, a whispered word that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere, perhaps pause and listen more carefully. It might just save your life. What would you do if you heard a baby crying in an empty cockpit? Do you believe these phenomena are just stress-induced hallucinations or something far more mysterious connecting the living and the dead? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more forbidden aviation investigations that the industry works desperately to keep hidden from public view.